The Eden Laboratory submarine was slowly gliding through the eternal darkness of the depths. The ocean surrounded the ship with a dense wall of pressure capable of crushing all living things in an instant. There was an atmosphere of concentration and routine inside. The crew was used to isolation and strictly followed the routine. The laboratory compartment was located in the very heart of the boat, protected by several layers of armored doors. A group of scientists led by Dr. Levchenko worked here, standing in front of an airtight capsule with the virus. Sarcophagus 7 is the latest bioengineering achievement. This microorganism could destroy entire ecosystems, or, conversely, transform them. In theory, experiments and developments were conducted. "Check the pressure in the capsule again," Levchenko coldly ordered his assistant, without taking his eyes off the data on the screen. "Everything's fine, Doctor," the assistant replied, wiping his sweaty palms on his robe. But after a second, the instruments gave a short beep, then another one. Levchenko became alert. A warning appeared on the screen. "Container integrity violation." There was a barely audible crack in the compartment. Everyone turned to the capsule, where a crack had spread like a thin web across the surface. "Isolate the ventilation system immediately!" Levchenko shouted, rushing to the emergency console. But before he could press the button, the crack opened. A thin whitish gas burst out, filling the room in a matter of seconds. Levchenko felt a burning sensation in his lungs. The assistant coughed, falling to his knees. The others also began to suffocate, clutching at their throats, trying to inhale air with their damaged lungs. "Masks! Seal the masks!" Levchenko shouted, but his voice was getting hoarse. The first infected appeared just a minute later. The young laboratory assistant, leaning against the wall, suddenly froze, and her body arched in agony. Purple bubbles began to rapidly swell on the skin, which burst with a disgusting slurping sound, flooding the robe with a viscous green liquid. She turned her head to her colleagues. Her eyes turned black, and her mouth opened in an inhuman scream. "My God! What is this?" The assistant shouted, but did not have time to finish. The girl rushed at him with terrifying speed. She clutched at his neck, and blood gushed out in a fountain. Levchenko recoiled, trying not to look at the horrific scene. The infected woman continued to tear the assistant to pieces, making muffled growls, like a hungry animal. "Isolation is activated," the mechanical voice of the security system sounded. "But the virus has already managed to enter the ventilation system." Meanwhile, in other compartments, the crew began to notice something was amiss. In the residential block, Engineer Orlov was sitting on his bunk when he heard a strange hissing sound from the ventilation grate. He came closer and suddenly felt a sharp tickle in his throat. A moment later, he was overcome by a coughing fit. When he raised his hand to wipe his mouth, he saw thick green goo on the back of his hand. Orlov opened his mouth to scream, but instead let out an inhuman wheeze, and his body began to deform, arching in unnatural poses. The screams were becoming more frequent. In the medical bay, an orderly tried to help one of the assistants, who complained of a burning sensation in his lungs. But after a few seconds, the lab technician fell down. His eyes turned black, and his skin began to blister. The orderly retreated, but it was too late. The infected attacked him, tearing his robe and skin with his teeth. The corridors and compartments began to fill with the sounds of panic. Screams, banging on closed bulkheads, growling and wheezing. The electricity began to malfunction. The lights were flashing, plunging the ship into an eerie atmosphere. The security systems blocked some of the compartments, but it didn't help. The virus was moving faster than people could contain it. In the command room, far from the epicenter of the infection, Captain Zhdanov peered at the surveillance monitors. What he saw was a nightmare. The laboratory turned into a meat grinder, where there were no survivors left. On one of the screens, he saw Levchenko standing in a corner. His face was covered in bubbles, and his lips were whispering incoherently until his body collapsed to the floor. Zhdanov clenched his teeth. The ship that had been his pride was now a floating prison for the virus and the monsters his people were turning into. Bangs could be clearly heard behind the closed airlocks. The monsters were getting closer. The temperature control system inside the compartments has stopped working. A system failure made the steel walls damp, and a barely noticeable fog enveloped the narrow corridors. The lights continued to blink, turning the brief flashes into grim images of horror. Monsters that had once been human roamed the compartments, greedily inhaling the air, saturated with the smell of fear. In the apartment block, several people took refuge behind overturned tables, building makeshift barricades. One of them was a junior mechanic. She was holding a monkey wrench in her hands, gripping it so tightly that her fingers turned white. "We won't last long here," someone whispered nearby, looking at the door, behind which came the sound of wheezing and inhuman growling. "Shut up," the junior mechanic said sharply. "If they hear—" But it was too late. One of the monsters slammed into the door with such force that its fastenings creaked loudly. Footsteps could be heard outside the door, rhythmic and heavy like hammer blows. The mechanic pressed his hand to his mouth, stifling a scream, while the others just prayed that the locks would hold. At the other end of the ship, Senior Engineer Kravtsov was making his way through the maintenance bay. His face was covered with perspiration, and his hands were shaking. He knew that time was short. If the power system completely failed, the boat would lose its ability to move and turn into a mass grave. A screeching sound came from the cavity in the hull above his head. He stopped. Silence. Just the muffled pounding of his heart. Kravtsov slowly raised his gaze. Something inhuman was looking at him through the bars. Black eyes without pupils. A face covered with mucus, disfigured by blisters that moved as if alive. The monster jumped off, crashing down on Kravtsov. The engineer screamed, grabbing a monkey wrench and hitting the creature in the head. The blow was strong enough to knock her off her feet, but the monster immediately got up. Kravtsov tore away without looking back. В лабораторном отсеке, который теперь превратился в логово монстров, рычание и чавканье звучали, как приглушенная симфония ужаса. Зараженные, покрытые волдырями и выделяющие слизь, грызли остатки мебели, кабелей и тел. Вирус превратил их в вечно голодных мутантов. Один из монстров резко вскинул голову, почуяв движение. Он издал жуткий вопль, который эхом разнесся по отсекам, словно сигнал охоты. Другие монстры начали двигаться, следуя звуку. В командном отсеке капитан Жданов вместе с Гординым и еще несколькими уцелевшими отдавали последние приказы. «Энергосистема падает. Осталось максимум 3 часа», — мрачно произнес Гордин, склонившись над панелью. «Отсек за отсеком мы теряем людей», — добавил еще один из членов экипажа, его голос дрожал. «Эти твари пробираются все ближе». Жданов посмотрел на экраны, где камеры наблюдения показывали, как зараженные ломятся в жилые кубрики, разрывая попавшихся моряков на клочки. Он понял, что сопротивляться бессмысленно. Они могли только задержать их. «Мы должны задраить наш отсек намертво, чтобы замедлить их. Оставляем только технический коридор до реактора», — твердо сказал капитан. «Реактор? Вы хотите взорвать лодку?» — в ужасе спросил Гордин. «Если они доберутся до поверхности, не выживет никто», — холодно ответил Жданов. «У нас нет выбора». В других отсеках начался ад. Монстры, чьи изуродованные тела все еще сохраняли отголоски человеческих силуэтов, прорывались через двери. Плоть выживших, их крики, звуки ломающихся костей сливались в кошмарный хор. В одном из отсеков взорвалась система регенерации воздуха, начался пожар. Младший механик вместе с небольшой группой выживших пробивался к центральному командному отсеку. «Там выход к реактору», — шепнула она, держась за раненого коллегу. «Это ловушка. Они там нас и прижмут», — ответил кто-то. «Если останемся здесь, сдохнем раньше», — отрезал механик, но его голос дрогнул, выдавая ее страх. Крики зараженных становились ближе. Темнота окончательно поглотила подводную лабораторию. Свет погас, оставив экипаж сражаться в абсолютной тьме, где лишь звуки говорили о приближающемся конце. Тишина в командном отсеке была угнетающей. Только слабый гул резервной системы питания напоминал, что лодка еще жива. Капитан Жданов, сидя за главным пультом управления, напряженно вглядывался в мониторы. Камеры наблюдения больше ничего не показывали. Отсутствие картинки не давало повода для облегчения. Звуки за переборкой говорили все. Глухие удары, скрежет когтей о металл, урчание голодных существ. Старпом Гордин сидел рядом, перебирая схему вентиляции. Его руки тряслись, но он пытался скрыть это. В воздухе стоял запах озона и горелой проводки. Все кричало о том, что системы на грани полного отказа. Гордин тихо выругался, откинув планшет в сторону. Живучести корабля хватит максимум на 2 часа. После этого мы останемся без света, воздуха, связи, без всего. Капитан медленно поднял голову, глядя на Старпома. Его лицо было выжжено годами дисциплины, но в глазах прятался страх. «Реактор», — тихо сказал Жданов. «Что реактор?» — переспросил Гордин, хотя понимал ответ. «Если мы перегрузим его вручную, взрыв уничтожит судно. И этих тварей, вместе с вирусом тоже». Гордин побледнел, глядя на капитана так, будто видел его впервые. «Вы хотите все взорвать? Жертвуем экипажем. Это же ядерный взрыв. Вспомни, что мы видели», — ответил Жданов. Его голос звучал, как сталь. «Вирус превращает людей в голодных монстров. Они никогда не остановятся. Если они доберутся до поверхности, все человечество обречено». Gordon was silent. His fingers drummed nervously on the table. After a minute, he nodded. "Okay, but I need time to prepare the system." "How much?" "Half an hour. Maybe less." Zhdanov stood up, glancing at the 3 survivors who were with them. They were all pale, emaciated, and their eyes resembled hunted animals. "We'll hold the compartment as long as we can," he said, picking up an old revolver hidden in the captain's cabin. "Gordon, get to work." At that moment, the doors shook from the impact. A dull, rhythmic thud came from outside. Someone or something was banging on the metal doors, trying to break through. Gordon rushed to the console, starting to enter commands, his fingers trembling, but moving quickly. Zhdanov, without taking his eyes off the door, stepped forward. "Everyone to the walls. If they break through, don't let them surround you." One of the survivors, Technician Orlov, broke off a piece of thin pipe and made a homemade spear by wrapping wires around the handle. He licked his dry lips. "They're going to eat us anyway, aren't they?" "We have a chance," Zhdanov replied quietly. The doors shuddered again, this time with a loud metallic squeal. The monsters outside were making sounds like a mix of growling and wet slurping. At some point, one of the steel locks began to crack. "Hurry up, Gordon," the captain shouted. "1 more minute." The door crashed inwards. The first creature burst into the compartment, its distorted body covered with bubbling blisters. She let out a loud howl and rushed at the people. Zhdanov fired. The bullet hit the monster in the head. The creature was finished, but others followed. The command room turned into a battlefield. People screamed, fighting back with whatever they could. Knives, pipes, pieces of furniture. Blood and slime covered the floor. The monsters did not retreat. Zhdanov released all his ammunition before one of the creatures knocked him down. "Captain!" Gordon shouted, but did not turn around. He was entering the last commands, and the monsters were already climbing over the console, reaching for him with their hands covered with bleeding sores. Zhdanov stood up, grabbing a metal rod, and violently struck the creature that loomed over Gordon. "Launch it!" Gordon, drenched in sweat and blood, pressed the last button. The system hummed, and the ship shuddered. "We have 20 minutes before overload. Everyone in the escape pod!" Zhdanov shouted, waving the rod, holding back the onslaught of monsters. His men ran, but the captain himself remained. He knew he wasn't going to make it. The last door slammed shut, leaving him alone with the approaching monsters. Zhdanov grinned, looking at the impending horror. "Well, critters, let's—" A junior mechanic rushed in after the monsters. His face was soaked with sweat, and his hair was matted and plastered to his forehead. In one hand she held a bloody wrench, the other hung limply, covered with bleeding blisters. The skin was torn in places. He was panting, wheezing, barely able to stand. "They are everywhere," he whispered, staggering towards Captain Zhdanov, but he immediately raised his hand to stop him. "Stay back!" His voice was firm, but there was a note of horror in it. The mechanic stopped. His body began to tremble slightly. His lips were shaking, and thick green liquid was leaking out of the corners of his mouth. He croaked before his voice turned into an inhuman roar. Gordon was the first to fly inside the capsule, followed by two sailors, dragging each other, and the last, slamming the hatch. He sealed it from the inside, checking the tightness, while outside he could already hear the blows, the gnashing of claws, and the growling of monsters. "Break away from the ship, immediately," Gordon ordered. He entered the command himself, and the capsule separated from the boat with a shudder. The capsule moved away from the airlock, and a moment later disappeared into the darkness. "The ascent has begun," one of the sailors reported. Looking at the instruments, Gordon collapsed into the seat, breathing heavily. His heart was pounding as if it was trying to escape from his chest. The rest of the sailors sat in complete silence, with only heavy breathing filling the cramped space of the capsule. Outside, the darkness began to dissipate, the water brightening with every meter, signaling its approach to the surface. But Gordon suddenly felt a strange itch on his skin. He mechanically ran his hand over his neck, then over his chest, but the itching intensified, turning into a burning pain. "Damn," he whispered, trying to figure out what was going on. The sailors, noticing his movements, began to look at each other warily. One of them came closer. "Is everything okay?" Gordon wanted to reply, but instead his breathing became labored, and he clutched his chest, writhing in pain. "Is the capsule infected?" one of the sailors shouted, looking around in horror. At that moment, the instruments signaled that the engine was ready to turn on fully. One of the sailors, without waiting for the command, pressed the lever. The capsule shuddered, and the engines roared, pushing them away from the crash site. "Hurry up! We have to get to shore!" the technician shouted, looking at the writhing Gordon, but no one believed in salvation anymore. Gordon collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. "Stop," he croaked, his voice barely breaking through his ragged breathing. "Stop! We are infected." The sailor at the console turned around, looking at him in complete horror. His hand was already reaching for the engine start lever, but Gordon's words made him freeze. "What are you talking about? What is it?" he choked out, watching Gordon writhe on the floor, trying to get up. "We will be saved." With a groan, Gordon pulled himself up to him, clinging to the nearest handrail. His face was deathly pale, and a thin trickle of blood was running down his lips. He grabbed the sailor's sleeve, clinging on as if his life depended on it. "Wait," he repeated, and a flicker of desperation flashed in his eyes. "You don't understand. The virus is already inside us. We must burn." His words ended in a rasp, but their meaning reached the others. There was a deathly silence in the capsule. The sailor at the console slowly stepped back, staring at Gordon with wide eyes. "No, that's not it," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. "We're not infected. It's just stress." Gordon grabbed his arm with all his strength, pulling him closer. "We have already begun to transform." He spoke in fragments. The strength was only enough for short phrases. "I feel, and you will feel it too. If we surface, we'll infect everyone. Above." The sailor started to retreat, but Gordon, summoning the last remnants of his strength, grabbed him by the collar, almost knocking him onto the console. "There's going to be an explosion," he whispered, his voice almost pleading. "We should stay here. We must burn." At that moment, the capsule shuddered. The huge rumble that came from the depths was unmistakable. The submarine, which remained deep below, began to collapse under the pressure and the approach of the final reactor explosion. The sailors exchanged glances. One of them, with a trembling hand, reached for the emergency engine shutdown button. "Damn, Gordon's right," he muttered. We shouldn't come up." An explosion that would tear everything apart was already inevitable. The capsule shuddered under the onslaught of waves raised by a powerful underwater shock, but inside, the walls could no longer protect the crew from what was happening. Gordon fell first. His skin rapidly blistered and ulcerated, and his bones creaked as if under pressure. He screamed, clutching at his face, but his fingers had already begun to turn into long claws. His teeth became sharp, and his eyes turned black. After a moment, he turned to the nearest sailor and rushed at him with a furious growl. Panic broke out instantly. The others screamed and tried to fight back, but the capsule's space was too cramped. The second sailor fell when Gordon grabbed him by the throat. Blood spurted from the wound like a fountain, flooding everything around. But as soon as the body sank to the floor, it began to squirm. After a few seconds, the new mutant stood up, completely losing his human form. His body was twitching in convulsive spasms, but his powerful arms were already reaching for the nearest survivor. A moment later, the entire space of the capsule was filled with terrible sounds. The clang of teeth, the rasp of claws on metal, the tearing of flesh. The carnage began. Those who hadn't mutated yet resisted to the last, but the virus had already invaded their bodies. The last screams died down, and the mutants, left without victims, turned their aggression on each other. They attacked the tribesmen, tore them with their claws, gnawed, splashing blood and mucus around the narrow room. The capsule burst like a shell. Outside, a huge underwater wave caused by a nuclear explosion was rushing towards her, engulfing everything in its path with fire. A flash of light burst from the depths, splitting the darkness of the ocean. The heat and pressure reached the capsule, absorbing it along with the mutants at the last moment. A huge wave and flames erased everything. There are no traces. Only the silent ocean, once again plunged into gloomy calm.